calling to order the Huron Board of Education work session for Thursday, July 17th, 2025. If you could call the roll, please.
Mrs. Henners, Dr. LaFay, Mr. Rager,
Here.
Mrs. Hartley,
Here.
Mrs. Mast.
Here. If everyone could stand, please, for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We need an approval of tonight's agenda for the work session. Okay.
Mrs. Henners,
Yes.
Mr. Rager, Dr. LaFay, Mrs. Hartley,
Yes.
Mrs. Mast.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, so tonight we're here to talk about student safety, and so that's kind of a big theme, but we're going to get to the work. So Eric Johnson is the board's counsel from Weston Hurd, and so he's going to kind of kick it off and get the conversation going.
Great.
Hi folks, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
So, student safety and student welfare issues is kind of a broad topic. And so I've been asked to really focus on 4 subtopics, if you will, this evening. Those 4 subtopics being the code of conduct, and when I say the code of conduct in this context, that would be for personnel in your board policies. So that'll be the first topic that I'll touch upon. The second topic will be the licensure code of conduct. So you might hear me say code of conduct, code of conduct. If there's any lack of clarity, to say, Eric, which one are you talking about? The good news for you, spoiler alert, is that actually your code of conduct looks a lot like the licensure code of conduct, the state's licensure code of conduct, which I think is a really good thing. A lot of policies do not expressly incorporate the licensure code of conduct, the state one. And so that's an advantage for you from a consistency standpoint. It also makes some things clear that might not otherwise be so clear. The third will be a brief overview of FERPA issues. And so FERPA is the federal law that relates to student records, student information to a certain extent. And then the fourth topic this evening will be, drum roll.
Sure.
House Bill 8. So it's oftentimes referred to as the Parental Bill of Rights. House Bill 8 passed within the last year, and it had two main components. One of the main components we will not talk about this evening, which is what's referred to as RTRI, Release Time for Religious Instruction. That one's been put to the side for this discussion, and we'll talk about what House Bill 8 provides in the way of providing parental rights in student health services, as well as with regard to the materials that you put into circulation for instruction purposes. So those are the 4 main topics. My understanding coming in this evening is that we have kind of a few goals that we want to achieve. One is to just give an overview of each of those 4 areas. Obviously, open for discussion. I certainly don't want to be professorial lecturing up here, and I'm going to hit them in a real overview so that then feel free to ask questions as we move through. So first goal would be to just have that discussion about each one of those 4 to raise awareness, educate, provide a baseline on those 4 topics, and then I think as we go through, you'll likely hear me provide suggestions on how to address these with your personnel, with your community overall, and again, you're probably going to hear me say training. So if you have on your bingo card this evening training as a free space, you might as well just mark it now as we go through, because I've been doing this for 25 years, and I can tell you the past few years, the legislation has come quick. It has oftentimes changed a lot of what you guys as boards do. In fact, you'll see things that have been completely flipped in how you need to kind of conduct operations. And so there's a lot, and training is one right now where in almost every area, and I know that lawyers get a bad rap for saying you got to train, you got to train, you got to do this, you got to do this, and we're kind of taskmasters on you got to read the policy, you got to amend the policy, you got to do all these things, and it's a lot. I understand that, but in these areas, I think it's absolutely critical, given the importance of the topics, that there's training really across the board. And so you'll hear from me suggestions as to how to approach these issues, make sure that your folks are educated. And when I say your folks, your personnel, really from superintendent all the way down across the organization, down to cafeteria, down to bus drivers, down to non-teaching employees. It's important that they understand the regulations of the code of conduct. It's important they understand what they can and cannot do on social media, those sorts of things. And then number three, I think from our goal perspective is coming out of this as a board, what do you want to see happen? And working with administration to say, okay, we think this is important, we should roll this out, we think this is a priority item, let's get that training on the books, let's talk about what that looks like, those sorts of action steps. Any questions or discussion, anything you want me to address or correct in what I've said so far, goal setting from your perspective on these things?
So if you think it might be helpful for us to just really quickly say like what we do, because I think all of us currently or have worked for really large organizations.
Okay.
So I think some of these issues, when it's a workplace issue, like we have our own mandatory trainings that we take. So maybe understanding like just a context for where we're coming in, because I think there's always that tension of we're locally, in Ohio, school boards are locally run. And so while it might be a law that then is pushed out to every district, but every district is going to have its own board that has its own level of understanding. It has its two executives, but there's the culture of the town, and then you have people from the private sector stepping into these roles as board members, who sometimes are making the ultimate call, and so their context and understanding, I think, plays into it. Sometimes there's some tension there.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear experience-wise what you've got.
I'm an engineering director for a large automotive supplier in the area. So, like you said, large organization has lots of trainings and things, so familiar with that. And I also was a scout leader for 9 years, so I had a lot of training and that they're required to do and changed many times, a number of times over that 9 years. So.
I was a PR doc for 17 years, and now I own my own
I work for the Foundation for Firelands, which is part of Firelands Health, which is our regional hospital here. And I am development officer, so we do, we have care source learning that we have to, like we do every single year, that goes over, HIPAA and all kinds of things like we're going to be talking about.
Public higher education for about 22 years at Ohio State, and now Bowling Green. So yeah, some corporate issues and prevention, violence prevention, Title IX.
I am in-house labor and employment counsel for a Fortune 500 company, so we do a lot of HR training and securities compliance. I've also been a volunteer for Catholic Church. Long time, so familiar with their training and background checking protections.
Great. So yes, a lot of what we'll be talking about, some of those things you'll have heard before, and so I will try to do it at a real top level, and if you want to drill down, then we can absolutely drill down on those things, but a lot of it will be kind of surface level, and then, as I said, feel free to say, wait a minute, what about the exceptions to then we can get into the exceptions to FERPA if you really want to do that. Okay, so I'll start with the code of conduct. So as I said, your particular code of conduct is a little bit different than a number of boards' codes of conduct that I see. It's not necessarily the standard, and I think that was done deliberately. I think you recently enhanced it And what I like about your code of conduct is that it specifically builds in the licensure code parameters, the Ohio licensure code for professional educators. That code is what governs whether any educator will receive their license, will maintain their license, or if there's going to be discipline as to their license. And so a lot of this, when we talk about it, you'll hear me say, okay, the district has their code of conduct, but then all of the personnel who have licenses through the state educator license, not the instructor license, would also be governed by the licensure code of conduct. And so think of them as kind of two silos. Oftentimes, if you have done something that you should not have done, you're playing in both spaces. But this is, from the standpoint of what you have on the books, and this was just revised recently, I believe in the spring of 2025, looks like last revised February 25th. So GBCB is that policy. I know some of you may have your computers up, or you might want to refer to it later at some point. I'm not going to obviously read you the policy, but it does lay out 9 expectations, standards that track specifically the licensure code. Some of the highlights of those, in general fashion, I won't go through all 9, but professional relationships with students at all times. And so, whether you're in or out of the classroom, whether you are on the field, whether you are participating in an extracurricular, or whether you are completely away from any school connection whatsoever. And that can be on spring break. It can be summer while you're coaching t-ball. These things through the licensure code, the Ohio licensure code, apply 24/7, 365. And so making sure that folks understand that, yes, when you have a license, just as I have a license, Mrs. Sanders has a license, Dr. Maffei has a license, we have codes of conduct, and you guys probably have licenses too. So you have a code of conduct. I know that at least 3 of us have a code of conduct that we have to abide by 24/7, 365, whether we are acting in that capacity or not. And so making sure that folks understand, hey, these are things that you need to abide by in your capacity. Because as you guys know, you go to the supermarket and it's, hey, I know you, you're the board member. And it's even more so for folks who deal with students on a daily basis, where you're always that teacher, you're always that bus driver, you're always that coach. And understanding that in each of those roles, what you might do outside of your standard hours can still be a concern for your own profession as well as the reputation of the district. So that's the general code of conduct. Just hitting a few of those. Obviously, can't engage in criminal activity, drugs, alcohol. You need to be very careful with. Obviously, you can't interact with drugs, alcohol, and students. Those sorts of things. There's a discussion about the handling of funds. There is the catch-all. The catch-all is the conduct that is unprofessional conduct in general, right? And so every code of conduct has that one catch-all where we can't anticipate all of the issues that might arise that someone may decide might not be the best thing to do. And so we've got to have this catch-all. And so you may hear me just talk about the catch-all. So it tracks very clearly and incorporates into your policy, which is important, the licensure code of conduct parameters. Why is that important? It's important because now it is a district issue. It is not just a state issue. The district has said, we want our folks to abide by all of these principles. We're laying them out. We're putting them on notice to you. We want you to know they're there, and we want you to abide by them. Now it's covered in the district setting. It's covered in the licensure setting, because we don't really have control over what happens at the licensure stage. If the state decides that they're going to take somebody's license, then so be it. We don't have a role in that aside from providing information if we are requested to provide information. And so on the district side, you have to deal with the employment perspective as opposed to the licensure perspective. There are other sections where you will, of course, run into, for example, GEH is staff-student relations. There's a number of things that are set out there that relate to student safety, student welfare, the way that we interact with students. Just by way of example, staff members shall not make derogatory comments to students regarding the school staff or other students. There's a number of those statements in that staff-student relationship as well that really puts a little more meat to the bone after the outline of the code of. And there are a variety of others that would come into play as far as just codes of conduct. So that's the general code of conduct staff-student relationship. I'm happy to answer any questions on that issue. So what's important about having that is making sure that people know it's there and making sure that people are familiar with the contents. And that starts with, obviously it starts with central office. It then moves down to your building level administrators, administrators who are responsible for particular areas as well. And then it should make its way all the way across the organization so that people are on fair notice as to what their expectations are in the role. When you're looking at how you do that, yes, it's easy to say, okay, here's your policy manual. And oh, by the way, here are 400 policies that you need to read through, and you should. I'm not saying you shouldn't. And do you guys have Public School Works? Okay, and so Public School Works is a good way to have that tracking. You absolutely should do that. Folks then have the opportunity to familiarize themselves. I am aware that sometimes Public School Works is not taken as seriously as it perhaps should be, and so there are times where you see that someone may have just spent 27 seconds on a module as opposed to doing it very thoroughly. And that's where I think training comes into place, where you're actually having in-person, hey, just so we're all on the same page, here are the expectations, here's what you need to be aware of. That can be done at building level meetings, that can be done at a district-wide meeting. It depends on how you'd like to roll those things out. But the code of conduct, particularly combined with the licensure code of conduct, is one that I tell my clients is an absolute must. From my perspective, and Dr. Chapman's heard me say this, he has sat through, I think, 3, 4, 5 of my, it is one, it's kind of my personal passion and making sure that folks understand what is in the code of conduct, because not all of it is self-explanatory. Particularly if you are, for example, a coach. Coaches are covered under, whether you are also a teacher or not, coaches are covered under the licensure code. And if a coach comes in, and I'll use an example, a personal example, my son plays for an academy soccer team. He's not a high school related soccer team. He is a minor, but his coach is texting him all the time, individually. He's the captain of the team, coordinates with the rest of the team. That's okay in the private setting. Right? There's not a code that says, hey, you can't do that in a private setting, or a law that says you can't do that in a private setting. In the public setting, the Ohio Licensure Code and the tip sheets that come along with it very clearly state, tip sheet number 2 if you need to, do not text individual students, period. That's how plainly stated it is. That's verbatim. There's not comma, hey, or here are the exceptions for it. If that person's your babysitter, if that person is a niece, nephew, now those things will be considered when it make it to the state level to be reviewed. But folks, those are things that aren't necessarily, everybody says, oh, this stuff's all common sense. Not necessarily. Not with how things operate. And social media is another one. And so I'm kind of moving into the licensure code overall. The licensure code was initially adopted back in 2008. The licensure code came about because of situations where you would have an educator engage in misconduct, say, on the east side of the state. I live in Geauga County, I'll say Geauga County, and maybe something wasn't so good about what went down, so to speak. Maybe there was an issue, and the decision was made, well, I'll tell you what, you just resign, you go away, don't come back around here, and go somewhere else. right? And we'll accept your resignation and we'll be done. Okay. And then something happens in Lucas County, and it's like, well, wait a minute. Something happened similar over in. So the state put into place a tracking system. In essence, the licensure code is a tracking system that requires certain reports to be made on a mandatory basis on educators, and then the other reports are discretionary reports. And so there are certain mandatory reports that would have to be made. The mandatory reports include resigned under threat of termination, resigned under threat of non-renewal, resigned in the course of an investigation related to conduct unbecoming under the licensure code. There's a new mandatory, they just added this one, a new mandatory report for removal of a substitute teacher from the available list if it related to conduct unbecoming. So, so are there certain mandatory, and these are serious. I mean, there are criminal consequences for a superintendent, particularly who doesn't report those situations to the state.
This isn't just for coaching, you're talking across
No,
the board.
this is for anyone who has an ed. So the licensure code
Anyone
applies
who's
to
licensed.
teachers, administrators. It can apply to paraprofessionals who have educator licenses through the state. It applies to coaches, the ones that people look and kind of do the. Those of you who are old enough to remember the RCA dog. The RCA dog head tilt is coaches. Like coaches are the ones where it seems that folks forget about, and so that's another one where, again, and James has heard me say this at almost all of my presentations because I always fit in licensure code, regardless of the topic I'm there for. Is you have to get across the entire organization on the licensure code issues, particularly fitting in the social media discussion. The social media was the 9th principle. So back in 2008, there were 8 initial principles. The only one that's been added since 2008 is appropriate use of social media. And there's some scary things in there. It talks about negligence in the way that folks handle social media. It doesn't. Negligence is an oops. It's a boo-boo. It's a mistake. It's not. There wasn't recklessness. There wasn't intent. There wasn't malice in it. It's, hey, I just made a mistake and I accidentally did this. And that includes, protecting your own personal electronic device. So if you leave your personal electronic device and a kid opens it up, because I don't know how many of you have iPhones, but if I camera function, I think I could probably get to most of your cameras and then take inappropriate pictures and then. So those sorts of things where it's just you didn't protect your personal device, you didn't protect your laptop computer, reporting of cyberbullying, even if you're off the clock, you're not, it's not during school hours. And then there's the one about posting inappropriate material that may relate to sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, which, and also it includes sexual orientation. Which, as you guys know, politics right now are laden with that. So talking to folks about, hey, you got to be really careful about what you post. You don't give up your rights as a citizen to First Amendment speech, but you got to be really careful about what you post. That's something that really, I think, has to go across the entire organization in that way. So licensure code, again, just recap, 24/7, 365. Anyone who has a license issued by the state, again, bus driver license is not covered by that. It's an educator-specific license, including coaches. Those 9 principles actually track your GBCB. That's where you've got your 9 principles from. So if you actually just read the GBCB, then you're pretty good from a licensure code perspective. There's, again, just to recap, so mandatory reports. The other reports are discretionary. It is often in everyone's best interest to make even those discretionary reports. It's tough for me to advise not to make discretionary reports, but there are some things that fall short of that as well. So it is situational, it is case by case. There are times, but the mandatory reports are ones that absolutely need to.
I had a question on for the district level of that, maybe, and probably for like James and handling issues. What what's like the threshold that they would have to say start an investigation on? I mean, is it someone has to make a written complaint, verbal complaint? Is it gossip? Is it, you know what I mean? Like, is there some threshold of when
Yeah.
he or us have to, I guess?
So investigations are, and I always do this for investigations because an investigation could be a quick question to confirm that something happened, and an investigation could be, you know, when you get into the more complicated or ones that are scripted by law. So, for example, a Title IX sort of investigation. It's really, it really depends on the situation. And so it's a typical lawyer cop-out answer, right? But, you know, if someone comes to you and says, here's what's happened to me, I'm making this report, you know, and it's a serious report, you know, I've been discriminated against because of the following, then it doesn't have to necessarily be in writing to trigger an obligation to start an investigation. Now, the ones that, you know, oftentimes are difficult to deal with are the anonymous, you know, statements that come in. You can't just necessarily just say, well, it's completely anonymous, and so the fact that it claims X, Y, and Z, you can't just say it's anonymous, and so it doesn't matter what's in the content. It always comes down to a content-based decision on what is in the content of the report. And then you have to look to, and there might be some things that you have to do to make a decision as to whether it warrants an investigation, right? So first step in an investigation is deciding whether there needs to be an investigation depending on what the content is, and then where you go from there.
So, who ultimately makes the decision on whether there needs to be an investigation? Is that the superintendent? Is
So
that the building principal?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, again, like if it's a, hey, he stole my pen, right?
Right.
Then that's probably not coming to the superintendent.
Correct.
If it falls within, and remember, you have policies that lay out specifically for sexual harassment, unlawful harassment, so it's, you know, race discrimination, disability discrimination, that's also unlawful harassment. You have you have bullying investigations that have to occur, and those are scripted by law. And this is, when you get into this, these can be very dynamic processes, right? And so it may start as a bullying investigation, but then as the student says, well, here's what was said specifically, it may then move into also a race discrimination claim, a disability discrimination claim, or a Title IX. And so, you know, I told you I was going to say training a lot, right? That's something that administrators need to understand, which is, okay, yeah, because everybody gets, and same thing, right? It's human nature. I'm in my, okay, this is a bullying investigation. I'm focused in bullying. I'm following the policy, checking off what I need to do, being, you know, conscientious about following protocols. Well, wait a minute. Didn't the person also say that this was said to them, this happened to them? Oh, okay, now I got to go over here and think about how that plays into that. And so you need to understand that investigations, and this is another one that you've sat through with me, is investigations are dynamic. Investigations, you have to, there's a lot that goes into investigations. And so to say, like, again, depending on the level, that depending on the specific allegations that are made, and that's why it's so important at the outset to try to find out, okay, what are the specific allegations from the individual? That's why your policies tend to encourage that it's made in writing, so that you have the story at the start, so you can process it accordingly. You know where to put it into a policy perspective. You also know specifically what you need to follow up on. And then if do more along the way, again, you're going to hear me talk about documentation too. Documentation on these is absolutely critical.
Do you mind going over again? I got some, but not all. Which like circumstances are mandatory for the district to report to ODE?
Yeah, so there's very few that are absolutely mandatory.
Okay.
So the mandatory ones are resign under threat of termination, basically any separation under a threat of investigation that relates to conduct unbecoming, So if the person is threatened to be non-renewed and there's an investigation going on, that would be covered. If the person retires under threat of non-renewal, termination, or in the course of an investigation into conduct unbecoming. So basically, if the person is departing under a threat of an adverse employment action, which is termination or non-renewal, or if they're in the course of the investigation into conduct unbecoming. If it's, I'm investigating you because you stole Jake's pen, probably not hitting that button.
But some of the bigger issues potentially, even if someone is just under investigation and they choose to leave before that, and I'm thinking of other things, not just public education. I'm thinking of some other like public agencies versus private. I think it's handled differently, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
And
'Cause I
this
wasn't
is
aware
what
of
I'm
this,
talking about.
or
Only applies to public
schools.
Public school districts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a person, is it that they would need to have notice at the outset of the investigation that this is potential conduct unbecoming, that's why we're investigating, or is it,
Not necessarily.
so it's something, they're under investigation for something that's pretty, falls somewhere in
Yeah.
there in the conduct, and
Yeah.
they leave, then that should be reported to state?
So, I mean, there's some easy ones, right? So if there's an allegation that you had a relationship with a student, a sexual relationship with a student, maybe you haven't confirmed whether that has happened or not. Maybe the police are involved in trying to figure out whether that's happened or not. And the individual leaves. The educator who's covered under the licensing code departs, resigns. Then that would be a mandatory. Now, if there's gonna be some gray areas in things that are less than a clear alleged violation of the code, and so there's gonna be some gray area. But typically, if the person is being investigated and it's so serious that it ends in the person departing, legal counsel is going to suggest that the report is made to the state. Questions so far?
I don't. It's a lot.
It's new information.
So just so I'm clear on code for licensure, code for employees, it covers anybody who is employed by this district.
Except bus drivers.
Except bus drivers. So does that include
So
SRO? Does
No,
that
it
include?
does not include SRO because technically the SRO is really important.
Unless they have a separate contract.
Does
with
they have a
the
separate
pupil activity.
supplemental contract or a contract with
Well,
the
that's-
school? Or
Separate.
So if
Yeah.
anyone is a coach, they are going to be covered by the licensing code, regardless of what they do in their quote unquote day job. Okay. The reason I keep on saying bus drivers is because they have a license, but it's not a, they have a license to drive a bus. It is not an Ohio Department of Education educator license.
Right.
So food service would not be covered, bus drivers not covered. Now we go through the same code of conduct with them because, especially with you guys, you've adopted your district code of conduct to mirror the licensing code. So it's even more relevant for them. But even in districts where that hasn't happened, where it's just a general code of conduct, but don't do the following things and it doesn't specifically dovetail to the Ohio licensure code, I still suggest to those clients, go through this with everyone. Because basically, if you line up with that and you don't run afoul of those big picture things, you're going to be in good stead whether you're a licensed or non-licensed employee of the district. But it would be those who have licenses that are educator licenses issued by the state.
Including a pupil activity license.
Correct. Yes. You had asked who kind of makes the decision for whether there's going to be an investigation or not, and that largely falls with the administration. So there may be times where the board, typically what you'll see in your policy, and your policy kind of tracks this as well when it talks about the structure of the board to staff relationship as well as the board to the superintendent relationship is obviously the superintendent is responsible for the management of the organization, the day-to-day operations. That would include investigations. Now that can be delegated within, right? And then there may be times that they're kept apprised of those situations. Certainly communication is of the thing. But typically it would not be the board who says, hey, something's going down over there. I'm telling you to conduct an investigation into that. There may be some communication on certain issues, discussion, but ultimately it falls within the administration unless there is an allegation against an employee that works, well, that is supervised directly by the board. So if there is an allegation against the superintendent, an allegation against the treasurer, I don't think you have a business director that is separate and apart that reports directly to you. Some districts do. Then any of those allegations, typically then the board president, vice president, the officers would then kind of coordinate it, but then there would be the opportunity to make sure through it. Obviously, you can have executive session to discuss personnel. You would bring the rest of the board up to speed on what's going on. Other questions? Again, I'm hitting these at top level.
We're gonna save like talking about training and stuff, so like after you go through all these, right? That's what you said you're gonna go through all four.
I mean, I'm kind of, yeah. I mean, I worry that I'm going to be duplicative in each one of these to say, I mean, the two trainings that I always tell my clients you absolutely need to do, the licensure code of conduct, and again, that covers the district operation. And so when I say, I guess this is cutting ahead, but it's probably good to just say it now. The way that I suggest the best way to do it is administration, because there are certain things specific to administrators in dealing with the code. They bear the brunt and the consequence of if you have failed to mandatorily report or if you fail to make a discretionary report that you really should. And so there are different things that they need to understand within the code. And then I do think that anyone with a license should hear in some fashion, and there's a spectrum of training that you can do. As I think I mentioned that there were tip sheets. Those tip sheets are great. The Ohio Department of Education, and they've had input from the unions in those. They've had input from the principals associations in developing those tip sheets. So the licensure code itself is 18 pages of kind of legal mumbo jumbo, right? And so it's not exactly a terribly interesting read that would keep you engaged. But the tip sheets all hit upon main issues out of the licensure code themselves, and they're front and back, and they basically are do's and don'ts. And so the example that I used for you was, it specifically just says in very plain English, do not text individual students, period, right? Easy to understand, easy process, as opposed to the licensure code. Lawyers got a hold of that one, as opposed to just the boom, 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 here's the practical use. So one of the options is, pushing out, and I think this is one that you absolutely should do if you're not doing it yet, pushing out those tip sheets in a regular fashion to employees to say, here's, tip sheet on, and they're specific to, there's one called extracurricular leaders, okay? So this one relates to those of you who are engaging. Now, I think it's good for everybody to read, like everybody should read them. There's one that talks, obviously there's a few that talk about social media. There are a few that talk about when remote instruction arose. There was a tip sheet that came out. So this is where you get like the scenarios. they're a little cheesy sometimes. They're kind of like the lawyers when you were going through law school, and it's like the alliterative names, like Polly Pocket does the following, and so it can be a little cheesy, but again, it's an easy read. It's something that will keep folks interested, and then typically on the back there are very clear do's and don'ts with scenarios, and and there are a number of them that you look and you say, these are not necessarily common sense. When the one that I pull from, the do not text individual students, the scenario on the back of the tip sheet is that a student reaches out to the French instructor on an evening to ask, and directly texts her and asks about a field trip. So it's not even inappropriate contact. It's not personal contact. It's school-related contact.
Why would the student have the French teacher's cell
Well,
phone?
that's one of the things that we talk about. And this is when we do the exactly. Well, and when we do the training, it's like, you don't want students to have their cell phone. Like there's not, and use the district application, use Remind, use this, use district email. Like that's okay. You can communicate individually with students on district email. But in that scenario, it's not even, it is school related. And Ohio Department of Education says, do not do this. Again, that's not necessarily, and it can be a well-intentioned employee who falls into that trap, right? And so making sure that folks understand what's out there. So tip sheets, definitely a thing that I would work into the training repertoire. Training with administrators is something that I think is important. And then I think we already have on the books, actually, staff training on Wilson Code of Conduct. That's one that I think is, again, a very important one for everybody. Same page, and usually it's very well received by the employees as well. They're appreciative of it. We do it in a way that is still engaging and interesting, and so that's the training on that one.
So I guess what I'm hearing is you reviewed our staff conduct policy, licensure policy, they coincide. So you feel like we have a good grasp on the policy as a district. Like
Yeah.
we are saying the right things in our policy. I think probably what my concern is we can have all these great policies and they're written down, but are we following them? Are we following them, and how do we change the culture maybe of kind of not following them and get everybody on board? Administrators, building principals. I mean, how do we get buy-in on this?
So, I'm legal counsel, right? And so I'm going to focus kind of on what I see with 25 years of experience of doing this, and then recognize that every district is different, right? And a lot of it, the buy-in piece of that might be a different discussion than what I'm about to put out. Oftentimes when I see folks that they're not enforcing a policy, it's because they don't know how to, right? And so I don't know what to do with this, and everybody's very busy, so we're probably okay, right? And so understanding, I think, any time that you want to put a focus on something, you have to be deliberate, right? And so if you see that as a concern, I think part of it is, again, back to the training and enforcing it, kind of reinforcing with administrators, look, this is an important thing. And we're going to give you the resources to know when you should be dealing with these sorts of issues and how to do it. And here are some tips. And here are some, and it doesn't have to be, there are times where you will, again, Title IX is the one that does take a long period of time. It's scripted out by law. But it doesn't, if you do it right, it doesn't have to be always that for minor non-Title IX infractions, right? Like these are things that we can take care of And there's kind of a broad spectrum of how you do that while still understanding the labor relationship and building a good labor relationship, but also, and frankly, I'm one, and most unions will tell you, you build a good labor relationship by following objective and not being subjective, objective policies, tie it back to that, stay consistent with your collective bargaining agreement, and we're treating people fairly. And so I think it does go back to making sure that people know how to deal with it. And then if you still see issues with them not dealing with it, then you've got to talk about how that is addressed.
Kind of along those lines, say you do have even a minor infraction or whatever, is there like standards maybe in our collective bargaining or whatever of like discipline, like, or is it very subjective on every case? Because sometimes that can create if you know what the discipline, like, you know, if there's a discipline and a culture of it, like there's accountability there, you know, like it might help that too. I don't know where we stand on that, I guess, and myself, but being newer at this point.
Yeah, so we do have the 2 collective bargaining agreements, and there's language in there about when a complaint comes in, how we have to respond to it. And so we have to follow that while also following the law and the code of conduct and balancing that. And it's important that when we're at the negotiation table reviewing language, that Eric helps us that. Make sure we're not giving away either obligations that we have to do or benefits or rights that we can do. We have to make sure we're not negotiating that way. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, and I think, do we have progressive discipline in both?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I think that's what you're.
There is some language in there that.
Yeah, so there are within contracts progressive discipline. Progressive discipline doesn't mean, you know, if somebody engages in serious misconduct, you're just skipping steps. It doesn't mean that, hey, I'm trying to avoid real serious issues, but you know, you've engaged with a relationship with a student. Okay, well, you're getting a written reprimand because that's the first step. Like, that's not. But it does lay out, and again, it gives you an objective measure for the, hey, your target, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that every time somebody goes, you know, you're late, well, we're going right to this. No, it can start with a counseling, a non-disciplinary counseling, and then if it recurs, you know, then you move it up. But again, I think having administration understand, you know, building level, those that are responsible, understand, okay, well, these are my options. This is how I can do this. These are some tools, again, for the investigation, because if you can make a mistake in the procedure, and regardless of how much you can prove substantively, if you screw up the procedure, it's a legal term, it's not going to stick. So, so making sure that folks understand how to go about that process. That's usually the second one that I suggest to administration, aside from like a general legal update on here's everything that's coming down from the state and the federal, which there's a lot. The one that kind of cuts across, and even for my private sector clients, like, how do you run an investigation? Like, what do you need to do? What do you need to think about? How do you go process the threshold issues that you have to approach? Am I the right one to be running this? Are there conflicts of interest? Should I do X, Y, and Z? And then even getting into the investigation, like, here are some tips on how to run an appropriate investigation.
Steps are to push out the tip sheets, to make sure our admin is trained, and then relay the staff code of conducts. And I think we have some of these. Did I hear you guys say that we have the staff code of conduct thing scheduled up?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, so for Convocation Day, Eric's going to come present, and so he'll be talking about these items. And then the plan for me is at building or department meetings, have those department leaders, the building principals or the department leaders, make sure that each month they're touching on elements of that code of conduct. The tip sheet, so hey, you got the tip sheet in your email. Did you review it? Were there questions? This scenario was a funny one, like, because they made it funny, or they tried to. But, just to keep the conversation alive and going, because if general staff sees that the leaders of the district continue to have focus and talk about it, then they'll know that it's important as a culture of the district. Yep.
After listening to what we've been talking about, I kind of wonder if we might have a little gap on the coaches part of that. How you brought that up, because while many of our coaches are teachers or under this, we do have a lot that are not, or just on supplemental contracts. We might need to think of some way to have a seminar for them, or they might not be able to make convocation or those types that you already have set up, but we might need to find some way to close that gap with our coaches, I think.
When we're talking about administration,
Yeah, go ahead.
when we're talking about administration, you guys knowing what's going on, is Matthew?
He's involved, yeah, he's at those
okay.
meetings, yep.
So we should,
Yeah.
maybe we could use that.
Well, we used to, back when my kids were in high school, we had a spring and a winter athletic mandatory meeting with all athletes in the spring, and then, what was it, fall and spring?
So the Ohio High
Oh,
School,
it was
yeah, the
awesome
Ohio High School
because
Athletic Association requires coaches to have a preseason.
we had
parent meeting.
everybody together, like
Yeah.
if you were in the fall, all sports came together, the athletic director ran the program, you had to go through the athletic code of conduct, there were scenarios that were given, and cell phone use, social media use, and yeah, it took up an hour of your evening or something, but it let parents and kids know this is what we expect of you, and coaches were there, and I thought it was beneficial. And you had to sign in, so your coaches and your building principal knew if you attended or didn't attend. And I don't think we do that anymore.
No, I would say that I've heard that we used to do that, and then in the last 13 years, somewhere it faded away. It went down to like the program specific level. And again, to your point, Chris, like some of the program leaders are, they have a job outside, and they come in and coach for us, and that's really their only contact with the district. So I know that in the spring, the director of activities and athletics held a head coaches meeting. He reviewed the revision of the coaching handbook. He got some input on the student handbook, and he talked about other like calendars, fundraisers, like other pinch points. And so, but that only had head coaches. So bringing back to all coaches each season, having that, and then making sure the parent meeting, preseason parent meeting, is touched on those points too. Is something that we got to do. Yep.
Different coaches relay this information differently. It depends on the coach. And if you want it the same across the board, you've got to have everybody on the same page and getting the same message. And I don't think that that's happening for us, unfortunately.
Yeah, coaches and extracurriculars are the ones where because you're dealing with Saturdays, you're dealing with times outside of the school that you're interacting with students, right? And so inherently there's a little bit of a difference with that compared to, okay, I know that I'm in a school building. I know that I'm dealing with in a classroom. There's just a, particularly for those that we have that are, we call lay coaches, right? Coming in, licensed as educators, as teachers, administrators, etc. And again, particularly if they're private coaches or they're involved even in travel or academies or what, that's a completely different way that they communicate with students. And there are all sorts of issues with, well, an athlete has a recruiting Instagram page. Can I interact with that person? Well, I can tell you that the licensure code says no, not directly, individually, like DMing. But wait, I'm trying to support. Well, so how do you deal with those things, right? There are definitely coach-specific issues, and it has been an issue for a lot of districts. And that's one where, especially to be fair to the coach, you got to put those folks on notice, right? Because they're not thinking this way. They're thinking, I'm coming in, I want to help the district. I want to coach kids. This is how I kind of coach in my private silo. Okay, yeah, but the way that Ohio Department of Education looks at this is sports exist only because of the curricular purpose. Curricular applies directly and in no difference to what happens on the field, what happens in chess club, what happens in any of these extracurriculars. And so there are specific provisions in the code. It says do not motivate by disparaging a student's academic or athletic performance. Specifically includes. So if you have a coach who goes out and I'll say choice language, but is using, and you look and say, would you do that in a classroom? That's how ODE looks at this. And that's how folks have to understand when you're coming in. ODE will say, would you have said that to that kid in a classroom? Would you have done that? Would you have gotten in his or her face? Would you have grabbed him by the shoulder pads and dragged him to and said those things in front of 500 of your favorite fans? So those are things that not necessarily, again, back to this, wow, it's all common sense. It's not.
Build off of what you were talking about, though. I mean, to me, training, there's like several audiences. You talked, Eric, about administrators, kind of our certified employees or like full-time employees. We talked about like the volunteers or kind of the non-full-time employee coaches, or advisors. But to me, the kind of the other pieces to like close this gap are the students themselves, and secondarily, or I guess equal footing, the parents and community. Because I think if we can hit all, it's not necessarily the same training, right, for all of those audiences, but if we can hit all of those audiences, or certainly make the training available to people at least in the event that they feel like they need it, so be it like on the website or whatever, then I think it's difficult to know what to report when you don't know, where the lines are. So, or there's not an easy way to report it. There's several different ways to report it. So that if I'm uncomfortable picking up the phone and talking to the principal because maybe it's a small town and maybe I feel like there's too many connections, what's the other option for me to report? That sort of thing. I think that's really like maybe our challenge if we're trying to go to a best practice is to not just like push out tip sheets, maybe do some like in-person training, and also make training available kind of on a perpetual basis so that, because when a parent, maybe I'm having a good day, I see the training, it doesn't really mean anything to me at the time, but come February, there's an issue, I see like my kids texting somebody and I'm like, whoa, what's that about? And now I can go and consult with them, the training that's out there, like rights and responsibilities type of training. So
Yeah, I think it would be great. I try not to overwhelm with my preferred action steps. I try to recognize practical, but it would be great to have something go out to parents and students that tracks the licensure code and helps us help them and vice versa on these issues. So, for example, just as an example, don't have your kid text the student, text the parent, or text the coach, right? If there needs to be a communication directly, like adult, parent, or guardian, to coach. If there has to be a direct, like talking to coaches about not giving out their cell phone, but also like not using it if you have it in a different context, right? Those sorts of, here are some expectations that we have of you as parents and students that would, because I can tell you I've had multiple situations where, as we say in the training, you are always the adult. Well, the kid kept on texting me. The kid kept on, I don't know how he got kept on texting me, and then, I started texting back because it just became easy. I didn't start it, I didn't, right? Well, help us help you by, here are the guidelines. We're going to use only, and I'm just using it as an example, the Remind app or Final Forms or whatever.
Senate
district
Bill 29
sponsored.
compliant
Well, there you go.
platform
Yeah.
we've opted to use. Right.
Thank you for not making me talk about Senate Bill 29 tonight. I appreciate that.
No, but Eric, you can see in a different setting, and I think I'll just go to coaching or advisors. You know, a lot of times, like the best practice is like, well, if the player is having a concern with the coach wants that player to coach them directly about it, right? Well, we know kids today, some of them have difficulty having in-person conversations, so they like to initiate communication via text, via some other platform, right? And so you can see where, like, if we're not aligning these messages and expectations on both sides, like, while that coach, that sounds pretty innocuous to say, I want your kid talking to me first, like, that might be deemed or, like, interpreted as an, invitation that, like, hey, reach out to me, give me a call, whatever, I want the student, reaching. And it's like, yeah, they're not on equal footing, right? The coach or the adult and the kid. So, I think trying to find that balance where they have good relationships, functional relationships, but also recognizing that safety needs within certain, whether it's office hours, whether it's, however that looks, at practice in front of other people, right? Versus, like private conversations or I'll give you a ride home and we can talk about it, that sort of thing.
No rides. No cars. Well, and I think it's difficult because I do think that the state licensure was ahead of state law in terms of grooming, because I know that grooming has been in the licensure conduct for years. And they even spell out specifically, because of course I'm the dork and I have it printed out, but not only grooming the student or minor, but also with their family. Because how often we see that, like, oh, how wonderful this coach, this teacher is giving my kids special attention, and they're talking to me, and they're so nice to me, and they're helping them, and I just want to be like, nobody should be taking that level of interest in your kid, right? It's just like, that would be my PSA for parents. It's like, nobody. I don't care how well intentioned. I don't care how admirable. I don't care what visit. Like, nobody should be taking that level of interest in your kid. But that is spelled out. So it's important for families to know that. Flag radar, but also for other people to know that, right? So if a student isn't catching it because it's grooming, like it happens slowly, it happens over time, they push boundaries, it builds, it can be a long time building. If another student is aware of what this looks like and what's not okay, and they hear the friend, maybe that student will anonymously report. Maybe they'll say something to their parent or somebody else, be like, I don't think that's okay. I'm worried about my friend because they don't see the danger here. But I do, and how can I? And then the question of, what do I do about it?
Yeah, and one of the points that I drive home in the training on that particularly is consent is not a defense.
Nope.
So
Not when you're
if
minor.
mom and dad say, it's all right that he texts my daughter or my son individually, like we've known him forever, it's not a defense. And in fact, it would fall within. So that was amended recently to include the 12-month window and to also talk about reducing the inhibitions through connections with the family. And so it is a very interesting provision of the licensure code, but the main point there is, it's okay that he gives my kid a ride home. We're family friends. No, not okay, even with consent. It's okay that he texts or she texts my student. No, not even with consent. Like that is the point that we drive home there on that particular issue.
And that change on the 12-month that he referenced is that they cannot begin a relationship if that student was a student 12 months prior. So once somebody graduates, sometimes people think, well, they're 18, they're an adult, like still not okay, like still a problem. So then I don't.
Also, the case of they're like turning 18 is not some magical
No.
like fence
No, it is
removal
not.
either. Like,
you can be 20 and be a student, and it's still a crime to engage in a relationship.
yeah, there's some
Yeah, there's a teacher-student specific criminal statute.
There's an issue of how, I'm not saying like this is an issue here, but like how then, kind of in the same way that I mentioned, if students are aware of this, so then somebody's like, hey, I'm worried about this friend, like I don't think they're supposed to be talking to this person or spending time with this person, other educators. So educators reporting, right? Because they're in the building all day. They're seeing this. And oftentimes it's like, there's a lot of students going in and out of that office and spending time in there. Like I'm not sure what's going on in there. What's the obligation of other educators, even without tangible proof, right? I think people don't want to believe something inappropriate or unprofessional is happening. And so kind of, is that included in your training too? And kind of what is their obligation there?
So yes, to an extent. There are some black and white guidelines, right? So if there's any suspicion that there's child abuse occurring or neglect, then that's an absolute mandatory report. If you observe something, then you're going to be in an obligation to report the situation. It depends on what you're seeing. So, I mean, I know where you're going. There's like this, I have a creepometer, right? This is my creepometer. So where on the creepometer am I reporting? And that's a tough call, right? So it just seems weird that they're talking. This is one of those of us who survived law school, like, you know it when you see it, but is there an obligation? There absolutely should be, in your mind, a professional obligation to deal with something, even if there isn't in specific. Like, if you really feel something's going on, right? Something inappropriate is going on, that should be, an educator should go to the building administrator to say, look, I've got a feeling here, like something, or again, that's a tough call, right? Because to make an allegation like that and have it not be accurate can be damaging, obviously, to the individual. And so I understand it's a precarious situation, but if there's any indication, observation that you've seen something inappropriate, there's an obligation to report that. Absolutely.
Yeah, except I was surprised that there was a case a couple years ago, I think over in the Cleveland area, where there were a number of educators. There was one maybe took a picture of a student, and it wasn't even, but and the way that one educator was talking about the student, there were like 4 or 5 other educators who were part of those conversations and failed to report. And there was action taken by ODE against those other for failing to report that this person was making those comments and had this photo of the student. And so that was a little surprising to me, of having to understand and get our colleagues to understand what this is.
I think when you're training though too, and I think this will be the art when you talk about, like, especially to our employees and coaches, is, I mean, part of like caring about your colleague is saying like, hey, I think, I'm not saying you crossed any line, but I think you might be getting a little close to it. So like help me help you before we're at a point of no return, right? So like, hey, your boundaries with the student seem a little fuzzy,
Sure.
And so I think there's probably ways short of being like, either you're fully like, I now have to report you to ODE or my own license is at risk, to I care about you and I'm worried about, that some of this might be construed as not great judgment, right? It's not necessarily like a violation. And this, how do we create a culture where folks feel comfortable having those conversations well before, both for the educator or volunteer or coach's sake and the student's sake, to be like, hey, let me like kind of yank you back before you do cross over the line.
Well, and that's your ultimate goal, right?
Right.
Your ultimate goal is self-regulation.
Yeah.
And early, so whenever I do frontline supervisor training, like those that are directly dealing with, whether regardless of industry, the point is always, and it's a cliche analogy, right? You've got a snowball and you don't want it to roll down, right? It's that boundary, like you want to hit those as soon as possible, and to have a colleague tell you, hey, probably shouldn't do that. Then you've done something completely right, where you have really made it go across the entire organization that folks are comfortable with others saying, I know what's right and what's wrong. That's probably like you're dancing on a line, and you're catching it so early before it starts to become an issue, and you're hearing it from someone who has your best interest. It's not the, here comes the big bad board or the big
Right.
bad administration, or here comes legal counsel. That's an ideal situation from a labor relations perspective. And this is when we do the training, this is to help you. This is to make sure you keep your license. This is to make sure you stay employed. And again, with the license, you lose your license. You're not teaching anywhere in Ohio for a public school district.
Does Ohio participate? I know there's like the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education. It's a national network where those kinds of things get reported. Because I know that's a question that comes up. Like, that's fine for state of Ohio, and you move over the state line to Pennsylvania or Michigan.
I think there is a reciprocal. I don't know if it's that one specifically, but I believe there is reciprocal reporting with certain states. I'm not positive on that one.
So in the, like, we keep talking about culture, like in the private sector, maybe Chris, you guys have this in your, a lot of public companies, especially if you're in manufacturing, like safety is really important, right? And like to the point that like every meeting starts off with like a safety share, or like if you hit on the topic of safety every time you convene. And I wonder if that's an opportunity for us. And I think it could be broader than just like, like warnings on how not to lose your license. It could be, mental health, like, but, could we have that like toolkit of just like super quick hits, and, whether it's your administrative meeting, whether it's a PD, whether it's, we're sitting down, like we kick off kind of like this, before dinner, but we're going to talk about safety. If safety is the most important thing to us as a district, we're going to talk about it at least for a minute or two before we talk about anything else. Do you guys do that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Every meeting, safety
And it could be like
Start
wear
with that.
sunscreen. It could be
yeah, it was like
it's
someone did that, or like in the winter, like make sure you take brake shoveling.
yeah, no, it's exactly it. But it's that mindset of putting safety first.
Well, and you certainly would have. You're not going to run out of material, right? Because even with House Bill 8, there's the safety component of student welfare, the student services, student health services, which is broadly defined. Those sorts of counseling issues that you get into, making sure that folks understand the differences now in how you have to secure parental consent for certain services to be provided. Like that, you certainly would have an ability to build in to any meeting. A significant portion could be related to safety, or you could do it as quick hitters, right?
See, and I'm not even
They're
talking
quick
like an
hitters.
either or,
Yeah.
right? Like you're going to do some like level 7 training maybe at the beginning of the year, whatever grade. But I'm talking about in addition to what is that something that just gets everybody in that frame of mind.
I think for sure, that's what we're going to have a new focus on as we move into the new school year. Yep.
But I'm hearing the talk of the tip sheets, and it just kind of made me think of a meeting I was at last night for our organization, and it was something as simple as we're trying to think of a way to thank our donors, and someone came up with a 3x5 or maybe 8x5, I don't know, card that just had a thank you note. Maybe it was 4 sentences, real short, and the question was asked, if you are the donor and you got this card, would you read it? Half of the room, half of our committee said, no, I'm not going to take time to read that. I'm going to either throw it in my purse and it's going to get put somewhere else, or I'm going to leave it on my table. And I guess I feel the same way with the tip sheets. They're not going to read them. They're not going to take time to, I should read this. From Dr. Tippy.
Of course they do.
It's not going to happen. And I just think what you're talking about it, the more we talk about it, the more people think it's important. And I just think we need to be really proactive in talking about it. I don't think people want more.
What's another thing to put in?
I honestly don't know off the top of my head. I would say like building meetings, they have staff meetings monthly, and then at the departments, like bus drive, the transportation, they have their monthly trips selection meeting. Custodials meet only like 3 times a year, kind of idea. Food service meets quarterly. So
Tim does announcements every day, and you could pick a day
Yeah.
a week to like hit on 60. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
just, again, super quick hit. I think they're like planting seeds, right? They're not all gonna.
I would say,
hit, but
yeah, I hear the high school announcements now that we're in the high school, and they through the Sources of Strength programming, they do have like tips and advice and facts about like mental health and those types of elements. So that's obviously just one theme of what we're talking about. But yeah, so they could expand that and talk about other areas of safety that creates awareness for students. And I know a lot of parents read those announcements or go to the website to access them. So
We do have mandatory for what Senate Bill 288 and the SAVE Act, House Bill 123, where we are required to educate students once a year. Aaron's Law on sexual abuse prevention for K-6, sexual violence prevention 712, and then SAVE Act is instruction on suicide awareness, violence prevention, social inclusion, and that's 6 through 12. So maybe there's opportunities there, right? We think about we want to get this in front of students, but some of this prevention.
yeah, and I mean those mandatory trainings we're doing with students, and so we could review the time of year that we're doing it, and then if we do it here, then some other point in the year maybe we do a refresher or a touch base or a review, just so it continues to be in their frontal cortex.
Yeah, and so I'm completely with you on sending people more emails. Like that's a minimum in my mind. That's a sheer minimum to do. I'm a huge fan of in-person trainings to do that, and it takes all sorts of different forms. I mean, I did one last year where it was the entire conference brought all of their coaches in for some pizza, and guess what? We just knocked out 12 schools in an hour, and they all heard the code of conduct. So there's all sorts of different. I have schools where every year I do their new teacher, new employee training so that we don't miss anybody, right? And so there are all sorts of options on that. But yes, I mean, with the tip sheets, completely agree with you. That's like a bare minimum in my mind as far as at least sending those out. Folks have the opportunity, and you've said, hey, look, here they are. You should read them. But in-person training in my mind is certainly more memorable.
Staff lounges or something where it's like printed out, it's there. If somebody happens to like pick it up and look through. I mean, they're catchy, right? They're attractive graphics. I think you sent some out that we saw, like the tip sheets. It's pretty
Yeah, they're well done.
easy infographic.
Yeah, and I would say, like from an educational perspective, right, we differentiate our instruction for students and different learning styles. So our staff also have different learning styles, retention styles. So, yeah, multimodal is key.
I wonder, like, to get started from that, like, kind of oil dilution, if we know that there's, like, the risk things where we have, and I'll throw out one, it's come up already, like, coaches giving students rides, right? That's, so we know it's a no-no. Parents may not know it's a no-no. So, like, in meetings, our coaches up front saying, listen, I buy, like, the license that I pulled am not permitted to transport your student in my car under any. So I want to be clear. Then the flip side is if I'm a coach, I need to stick with the schedule I've set for practice or whatever, because when I decide to end practice a half hour early and I've got kids that don't drive that all of a sudden are looking for rides, that creates drama, right? And risk. So, I mean, all of those, how do we tie up like those kind of scenarios that we know maybe are higher risk versus some of the texting's another great example. If you set that expectation on both sides, like, hey, I can't text your kid. I don't want your kid texting me. If they do text me, I'm not going to respond. Not because I'm a jerk. I don't like your kid, but because I'm not permitted to respond. You know what I mean? And here's the solution for that. Like, how do we kind of bring those two things together on like let's call it, just start with like the 5 most common kind of higher risk scenarios, and then we can start to like tackle things from there. I don't know if that's a conversation you can have with your admins or whoever to like help identify those. But it seems like, I don't know, you might as well prioritize as like a plan of attack. Just trying to do it all at once becomes a little bit like white noise, right?
Yeah, I like the idea. It's kind of like a David Letterman, right? Top 5, top 10.
Bottom
Yeah,
5.
Bottom 5,
Yeah.
top 10, however you want. But yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. Quick, easy hitters that make the point, bullet point, one sheeter that folks see, and yeah.
I do love the idea of going back to like an in-person. As much as we roll our eyes a little bit, we know that those organizations for sports, a lot of times they're not hitting on any of that kind of stuff. It's very much like perfunctory, right? Here's the schedule, here's the fundraisers.
Oh, by the way, students, here's what you can't do, or you'll get kicked off the team.
Yeah, which is good. I mean, that should be covered. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't have it missing an opportunity to cover some. Orientation kind of thing.
A separate athletic code of conduct.
Oh,
So we have one that's active. It's old and outdated. The director of activities athletics was working to create a new one, gaining some student input and things like that. But it wasn't recommended to the board.
Particularly on the social media, on the No Rides Home, which, yes, that could be another place to build that, just to continue the consistency throughout. To your point, at some point you're going to see these things, right? Whether it's through the tip sheet, whether it's in person, whether it's in the top 5 things to avoid, build it into the athletic handbook, just another spot.
Great, so that's one topic.
Well, that's kind of
two.
two. Kind of two.
2 more to go.
Okay, so FERPA. Again, I'll high level FERPA. So what does FERPA do? FERPA prohibits the disclosure of personally identifiable information. So you'll see the PII reference, personally identifiable information of students. So this is only related to student records. This does not apply to employee records. Employee records are completely separate from this, and there are a few specific laws, but not in this broad spectrum regulated student educational records. FERPA is the federal law. There is a state corollary as well, which is, I think, 321, for those of you who are keeping track at home and want to read that one later. So, in general, and you do have, again, you actually have a lengthy policy on FERPA. It is JO-R that talks about, in general, what student records fall within personally identifiable information. It talks about directory information. So boards of education can designate what information is called directory information, and then that directory information is able to be shared in a broader fashion than your personally identifiable information. In general, the PII is prohibited from disclosure to third parties and really should be only limited in access to those who have, you'll hear this, a legitimate educational need to know the information that is in those records. So that's the top level overview. There are some exceptions to FERPA. If there's a health and safety situation, so disclosure of records, if there's, and this has to be kind of in a real time situation. So where you're seeing this happen frequently is access to video records or to student records for law enforcement if they are currently in, like, something's going down current. This is not, hey, I think something happened 3 days ago, I need the education records. Then they would have to go through a subpoena process. And so it does relate to law enforcement as well, as far as how you regulate the student records that you go to third parties. In general, so kind of cutting right to the chase, for board members processing personally identifiable information, there will be times that you'll have access to that. I can think of the main one is going to be for student expulsion or hearings that might come to you that directly relate. So disciplinary records are education records. They are protected under FERPA, but because of the state law and how boards can hold their hearings on expulsion hearings, those records would be accessible to you. There may be a few other instances where you might need to know personally identifiable information, but in general, board members don't typically need that information down to a specific student's records. Typically, when you're looking at situations that deal with student discipline, there's aggregate data or building data. Those things are not those things are not student records. Those are your district records. It's when you drill down into, well, I want to know the specific student disciplinary consequence that occurred on X date. Unless there's an expulsion hearing, that might not be proper for the board to have access to. Talk about with FERPA.
Question. I think you kind of touched on a little bit, say, video. So that line between, like, something happens in a school, and say somebody, school personnel has access to video, they're looking at it, they bring law enforcement in and share it with law enforcement. I'm hearing that is potentially a FERPA issue because if it would need to go through a legal process to assure that the student record is being protected, the student privacy.
Anytime we have a video recording, the first question is what's on it. And so the content is going to drive what may be protected or not. So oftentimes, let's start with the ones that are easy. I just had one last week. Law enforcement was asking for the video of the parking lot because somebody backed into somebody else. We're not in the education record zone, right? That record might be a public record. It might not even be a public record because it's not something that we're maintaining to document the functions of the district necessarily. Now, if it was one of our vehicles, now we're probably into a public record situation. When you get into video that has students on it, and this has gone back and forth over my 2 decades. So if you've heard differently, you probably heard differently 15 years ago. There is it's called the FPCO. There's an office at the federal government. There used to be. I'm not sure if there will still be. That interprets FERPA, and they're responsible for enforcing FERPA. And we have had situations over my years where folks have made complaints to the FPCO, and it's a slow process, but they eventually address them. So, with regard to videos, if there is, for example, a fight, and there are 2 students in the video, and they are fighting on the video. So this is a common scenario, right? If they are disciplined, that video becomes an education record for either student or both students. If each of them is disciplined, it is an education record for them both. So now you're into FERPA. So if this was a video from 3 days ago and law enforcement wants to see that video, then FERPA protects that video. We would suggest to them, and we obviously always want to cooperate with law enforcement. We would suggest to them that they provide a subpoena. You get two different types of subpoenas. There's a subpoena that is a criminal subpoena that often says do not disclose the existence of this subpoena, in which case then they get the video and we don't have to notify parents. If it's a subpoena that doesn't have that, as I call it, the magic language, then there's a process you have to go through to say, hey parent, the law enforcement has subpoenaed this, you, the parent, have the opportunity to file a motion to quash if you don't want the records to go out. Otherwise, it's going out on X date. There is, now, if no student is disciplined, it could be different. Also, injuries. So under FERPA, if there's a video that documents an injury to a student, it can be protected under the law as well. So it's disciplinary, but also if there's an injury, that's kind of the oft forgot. It doesn't necessarily have to be a discipline situation or that fight caused the injury. It could be that the student was just fell down the stairs, for example. That could be protected by FERPA if it documents an injury. Now, if there's video and in live time we have a serious safety threat, your legal counsel is going to tell you to err on the side of providing that record as soon as possible to law enforcement. So, and it would fall under the health and safety situation. So any active threat of any sort would be one level. Even through the system would be permissible.
Does any of that apply to extracurriculars at all? I mean, I'm guessing not. I mean, they televise football games and whatever all the time, but I just thought I'd ask because how some of the other things apply to.
Yeah.
Like
so
we were just talking about coaches get applied to.
Short answer is yeah. For a variety of reasons, but yeah, I mean, if you're out participating in public and
Public ball field, whatever.
you will have, and I'm sure your forums have sign-offs on certain things. There will be times, though, what you need to be careful of, you can opt out of directory information. And I've had a situation where there was a student who, it was not a good domestic situation, had moved two counties over, and had opted out of FERPA. And unfortunately, it was first day of kindergarten day, and guess who ended up on the front page of and so FERPA is a real, you have to pay attention to FERPA. I know there can, it's the most engaging of trainings, but there are situations that create liability, and there are situations that create problems that FERPA needs to be followed. So teachers talking about, you can't talk about grades of a student with other students. There are certain practices that some teachers have about putting up grades or having names associated with grades. Those sorts of things. And I'm sure they've been trained on FERPA. It's certainly something that wouldn't hurt for reminders.
Teachers among themselves, right? Like teachers talk and figure, well, we can talk about this
Correct.
issue. And it's like, no, you actually shouldn't be talking about that issue with another teacher.
And I mean, I don't mean to make this even more complicated, but what you have available now online through Progress Book, Infinite Campus, do we need to pay attention to who has access to what within those systems as well? Is there a legitimate need to? Bill 8? Or any other questions so far? Okay, House Bill 8. So, House Bill 8, again, incorporated the religious release time for religious instruction. You might hear me say RTRI. That's kind of in its own silo. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. That's the one that then required the boards to provide time. Okay. There are two other main components to House Bill 8. And so just, again, surface level, you have already, this is good news, you've already incorporated the requirements for policy into your policy, and that policy specifically is IGBLA. Yeah. IGBLA, and it's called Promoting Parental Involvement. So that's the piece that incorporates the two other of the three main components of House Bill 8. And so, cutting right to it, so within this, and I'll speak in generally, and if you need me to go back to specific definitions, I've got them. So within this, there's basically a prohibition on providing sexual content in instructional materials to those that are K through 3, and then making sure that you're providing age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate content on form. So that's the general gist. It does build in a process of disclosure to parents as far as opt-outs. It also builds in the ability for a parent to challenge if there is a material in the instruction that they believe would meet the definition of sexual content. Sexual content does, by definition, and I'll work from your policy, that way it's staying consistent. Just reading a little bit of this for you. The district ensures any sexuality content is age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate for the student receiving the instruction, regardless of age or grade level. Provides parents the opportunity to review the instructional materials, and then sexuality content. So the definition is included in your policy. Any oral or written instruction, presentation, image, or description of sexual concepts or gender ideology provided in the classroom setting. So that's the definition that was built into the law that you've now been required to put into your policy. So it is something that principals are going to need to be aware of, because the challenge to materials by law and by policy goes into the principal initially, and then can make its way to the superintendent, and then potentially makes its way to the board. And your policy does include, if a parent appeals the superintendent's decision, the board must review the superintendent's decision, and if the board determines it necessary, hold a hearing on the superintendent's decision. So you're not required to hold a hearing. That would be a board decision that you would make on, and again, this is basically, some districts already have, and I think you may have it as well, I didn't check, a book challenge process or an instructional materials challenge process. This is very similar to that, except it is specifically outlined. These are the steps in the law, and now you've built them in the policy.
And I think is the law, but it excludes what were mandated for the sexual abuse prevention training and the sexual violence and dating violence prevention training.
And so you are absolutely, so as part of the curriculum, if it's state required curriculum, it is excluded. There is, not to drill too far into the weeds on this, this is something that may get clarified by the state in legislation. The question is, what is instruction? Is that classroom libraries? Is that curriculum? And there's some gray area.
Really questionable to me. That level. I'm sure kids are getting books from places other than the library, but.
So that's the first component. The second component, and again, this is built into the same policy too, even though it's kind of two very different concepts, but it is in the same policy because they both come out of House Bill 8. So this goes to student health and well-being, and this is again, I'll try to paraphrase it without getting into all of the legal language, but this relates to the student health services and providing counseling to students, particularly, and this was the main focus of the legislation, for those students who may indicate that they are having issues related to gender ideology, transition, etc. And so there is, as you will see in your policy, a process that needs to now apply, and parents from the perspective of providing consent on those particular issues. We have developed, and I've already shared with Dr. Tatman, there are proposed checklists to go through these situations, as well as draft notifications. There are certain notices that have to go out when you encounter situations, and we've provided those to the district under attorney-client privilege for how to address as these situations happen.
Situation where a student, they mention, an issue where gender ideology, but in the same discussion is talking about like what could potentially be abuse in home. Like how does a counselor or a teacher, like how do they balance that? Because we do know there are scenarios where the kid may be talking to someone at school because they don't feel safe or they're not safe at home given this issue or some other issue. We know that there's kids who aren't safe at home for a number of reasons.
Yeah, so I think we're going to be in one of those situations with what specifically was said.
Right.
Right? I will tell you, if there is abuse, if a student comes in and says, again, I'm taking the kind of the easier scenario, right? My mom / dad, guardian hit me, right? Now, the fact is, your guardian parent hit you. If that's a child abuse situation, we are reporting. The sentence may end because I am considering transitioning. In my mind, there's the abuse, and then you may have to then decide from the policy application and the House Bill 8 application if counseling can continue to be provided to that student at that time. But we are always going to report suspected child abuse.
You're talking about whether or not counseling can continue with that student in the district.
Correct.
Outside of the district, it's not an issue. It's whether the district continues counseling for
It is
that
not
student.
our issue
Correct.
outside of the issue.
Correct.
Correct.
Oh, I don't know. I just wanted to clarify this.
Unfortunately, I know exactly where you're going from a humanistic perspective. Unfortunately, our hands will be tied that if the parent says, I don't want you to provide the following services to my student, we are not providing the following services.
Talked before, like, our personal opinions don't really like override what our legal obligations are on behalf of the district. So to that extent, I have personal opinions. But there's not really a point in laying them out here. At the end of the day, we're still a nation bound by law. Certainly a school district bound by law. So really don't.
Yes.
So they go. But the point being that our obligation we try to set our compensations on what's best for kids. And so I think an opportunity for us to figure out, I'm sure, they'll probably brainstorm solutions, but what is best for kids in those situations and what other resources outside the district may exist that aren't handcuffed, for lack of a better word, by this type of legislation, but can still save kids in a ideally safe and confidential way. Be it, nonprofits, be it child protective services, whatever else. So I don't know if there's an opportunity to identify what those sources are in our communities so that if we find ourselves in that situation, we can, while we may not be able to directly provide those support services, we can direct them to where else they could receive them in the community.
Yeah, and I would say when House Bill 8 passed and then the policy came in, the counseling department was looking at that, reaching out to professional organizations, peers, for guidance, direction, legal updates for guidance. They don't necessarily have all the answers today, but they're continuing to work on that because their core is doing what's best for kids and supporting kids for success. They also won't violate the law though, so they want to make sure that they're staying within those parameters. So yeah, it's something that is evolving as we get ready to gear up for the new school year, for sure.
So we're required to promptly notify the parent when there's a change in student services. Student services specifically can include counseling services, but also includes, I'm going to read this in hopefully, students' mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being, or the school's ability to provide a safe or supportive learning environment for the student. Then the definition of students' mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being is defined at a minimum. Sickness, physical injury, psychological trauma, harassment, intimidation, bullying, any request by a student to identify as a gender that does not align with the student's biological sex, and then exhibition of suicidal ideation. There are also
Talking.
Yep.
Request. The actual phrase is request by a student. So whom would they maybe making a request?
If you would prefer,
That you call me by a different name.
and within your policy, and this comes right from the law as well, district personnel are prohibited from directly or indirectly encouraging a student to withhold from a parent concerning the student's mental, emotional, physical health, as I just defined, all of those components or any of those components. District personnel are prohibited from discouraging or prohibiting parental notification of and involvement in decisions affecting students' mental, emotional, and physical.
There's no limit or exception where there's a belief that the kid is a victim of abuse or that notification would create an imminent risk of harm to that student.
But again, from our perspective and from a legal perspective, we still have child abuse reporting that we are all mandatory reporters. No, you guys aren't mandatory reporters, but anybody who works for the district is a mandatory reporter. Now, some of us you might be a mandatory reporter in a different context, but as a board member, you are a mandatory reporter.
Because we were district employees, we were mandatory reporters.
I think you should be. That's House Bill 8 in a nutshell. There's a lot to House Bill 8 that's going to be, in practice, very difficult to manage. It is not an easy one to just lay out in policy because
Are there any legal challenges to House Bill 8 and they impact its viability?
actually not. We've had challenges to House Bill 68, which was the athletics participation, the denial of gender-affirming care. There have been obviously legal challenges to the executive orders that we've seen develop on. But this is one I have not seen a legal challenge to this bill. I don't know if that a special interest group might wait until it's applied in practice. From a standing perspective, I think it all legal there. Yeah.
might kick in.
but on the face of it, from a constitutional term, that's not it. So that's one. Again, takeaways for that one. That one is definitely going to be a recurring how to work with counselors, how to work with, because this is one where well-intentioned folks could make mistakes, just whether intentional or inadvertent.
To training students or providing students with information that makes it clear that if they share certain information, that teachers or counselors will then have to take certain actions so that they know kind of the cause and effect up front and can make decisions about with whom to seek counseling or share information with, maybe at the front end of the equation.
I think the only thing we have to, as a district, be careful of is that section that I read you about. District personnel are prohibited from discouraging or prohibiting parental notification of an involvement in decisions affecting.
I mean,
That's a very broad statement.
yeah, I don't disagree, but is there a way to neutrally just provide the facts without providing any sort of opinion or direction one way or the other, just so that kids know going in, if you do this, this will happen. If they don't like what will happen, it's just factual. That's not really. That's not just laying out the fact, right?
So, I go back to SAVE Act, House Bill 123, which is instruction in suicide awareness, violence prevention, social inclusion. A lot of times I do mental health first aid training. We always provide a list of resources that are available to anybody at any time. Because people are all over the place, they may not have accessibility to counselors, so we do, texting lines, phone lines. So I think that that's an important piece that I would assume or hope is part of that education that's provided there. So I think it comes in other ways if this legislation is strictly trying to go after one particular set of circumstances within a student and wanting and requiring parent notification, like that's fine. I think as far as assuring the students are okay and can access resources if thinking of self-harm, if in these other circumstances. I think state law then is already requiring us to provide these other resources to students.
They may not realize that their parent has to be notified of that. I think at the beginning of most counseling appointments in general, it's pretty common practice to say, everything is confidential. Except for maybe for the recorded, so.
Well, it's broader, right?
This
Like
is
if I'm
different.
telling my teacher, I hear what you're saying, not like more of a professional type of. Well, what if I'm just telling my teacher? Like, actually, I like to call John. Thanks for asking. Oh yeah, now I have to send this notice to the parent. And again, I'm not saying that. Again, we have legal procedures to follow, but is there a way to mutually provide information to students so that, again, they just understand the cause and effect, or at least they understand if this, then this happens. And whether they draw an opinion as to whether it discourages them or not is really not within our control.
Was it something like a Title IX almost, where, right, a Title IX, somebody starts disclosing something to you as a mandatory reporter, like I have to say, I need you to know that I am a mandatory reporter, so I'm going to need to share this. I'm going to need to report this.
Yeah, let's do it, because I do think it's going to be a little bit, I get it's a gray area for merging the emerging law hasn't been fleshed out with cases and probably won't be for a few years. But in the meantime, we're talking about kids in some cases that are in a statistically really vulnerable population. Where like it's like for some of these kids, like finding the right resource to have a conversation safely is a life or death matter. And if it's no longer the school, because the General Assembly was deemed the school is no longer safe places to have these conversations, that's fine. Like I'm not here to debate that, but I do believe that kids should have the disclosure up front to understand the cause and effect. Like if they share certain information, this will be the things that happen next. They have a right to know that up front so that they can seek the resources in the right place that fit them, in my opinion. And I think as a board, then we can decide like what risks we are willing to assume as a district and what we're not. Again, always complying with the law, but understanding that there's some gray or emerging area still as this law, kind of takes off. I guess that I pose that if there's interest in that particular issue, but to me, I don't know. Like, kids have been told for the longest time that certain things are by legislation they're no longer safe spaces, and I think kids need to know that.
I thought that was the whole thing. There were safe spaces, kids could disclose, talk to someone, and it would be okay. But now this is saying you can go talk to anybody you want, but now they have to tell mom and dad or guardian that you've said this. So then there are no safe spaces.
The kids just like brainstorming. Maybe that's not even like a decision they want to make. But like if they use certain words, is that going to give you like magic words, trigger the magic number to mom and dad? You know what I'm saying? Like again, it's
Education is very, very, very difficult right now across the entire spectrum. There are so many things that seem like natural. Like we want students to feel that they fit in. We want students to find their place. We want students to thrive. And we want to be able to tailor to each student and what they need. And there are all these things that, because of federal and state laws, that we can no longer do, that we did at higher ed, that we did as of 2 weeks ago, that we can no longer do. Offices don't exist anymore. Positions don't exist anymore. Resources don't exist anymore.
But I'm literally, my question's practical. Like I hear everything you're saying, and I'm not here to debate politics. I'm here to debate practical, and that is like, what are we able to inform kids without coming, and again, I guess to me, if the legislature or folks who prosecute these things would say, well, I think by accurately describing the cause and effect that you are discouraging kids, then that seems cynical because what it suggests is like, no, we want to catch kids doing this so that we can notify their parents rather than again I would assume the other way to look at it is we're going to take school counselors and teachers out of the business of receiving this information without notifying parents. But all we're saying is it's illegal to notify kids up front that that is the state of the law so that they can make an informed choice about where, to whom they want to share what information. Fully informed of then what happens next. To me, that seems neutral. I do it in my job all the time. Sure, you can join the union. It's fine. You're right. But here's what will happen if you do. I'm not telling you whether you should or you shouldn't. I'm just giving you factual, neutral information. Yeah. And if you don't like it, that's cool. Then maybe that will inform your decision. But I'm not tipping the scale one way or the other. I'm just laying out the facts. So I guess, it would be helpful to know more about that risk assessment. And then I think as a board, we make the decision where we're comfortable. And we, I think, collectively try to set our compass on what's best for kids. But
is there a student handbook? Like, does this policy somehow end up? I don't know offhand what our student handbooks say about, availability of counseling services and things like that. And is there a place because I know all the students read pour over the student handbook from cover to cover. But at least, you know, one place that is accessible to, because those are all online and accessible to students, that they sign that they received it. Didn't quite read every page, but
Or
one
maybe it's a
thing.
very neutral letter that goes out to parents, but it's posted in places that are prominent in schools so that kids who are interested can see what information can share with parents on that topic. To the point of keeping kids that are hearing about the crossing. So General Assembly is proud of what they've done, so let's talk about it and shine a light on it so that everybody understands it.
Just an awareness.
Well, but this is a culture shift. A lot of these kids, they've been told, these are people you can trust, these are safe spaces to share information, and now it's about education. Sure.
Did you say that?
I don't know. I wouldn't say it's ever been promoted, but I think that there are instances where students feel comfortable sharing things with a teacher, whether it be ship issues, gender issues. Maybe they've suffered some kind of, you know, sexual abuse on a date or something, and they share that with a teacher. They may have never shared it with a parent, but for some reason they feel an affinity towards this teacher, and this teacher is receptive to that. And so, and now we're saying to kids, well, don't share anything with your teacher that you don't want your parents to know. Essentially.
I think too, like we're working through it as far as with the counseling staff and then with all staff really. And you know, maybe some of our behaviors are going to change in that if a student says, "Hey, I'd like to be called a nickname," right? I don't think we necessarily need to judge the nickname as far as a gender identity to that nickname. There's a lot of names that are gender neutral, and then there's nicknames that don't have a gender at all to them. I can think of some students that have nicknames that are just, yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So, so I think on the staff side, training is like if a kid says, "Can you call me this nickname?" Just call them the nickname. You don't need to ask the details of why, because if you don't know the details of why, then I don't think the law would force you to have to go tell mom and dad. Maybe you need to tell the student, "Hey, I'm going to call you that nickname because you asked me to. When I have parent-teacher conference, I'm going to use that name in front of your parents." So then maybe the student will self-reflect and say, "No, then don't call me that," right? But again, and I think too, like working with students, there's going to have to be understanding of that line of like, hey, if we continue this conversation, like there is some mandatory reporting I'm going to have to do. Don't say it that way. Say it in a caring and supporting way. And I would think that line is somewhere. The law probably has not yet defined it through court cases, but I would say the law is probably somewhere. I haven't advanced their initiative. I haven't helped them with something that they're doing that their parents might disagree with. They told me something, and I said, "Hey, if we continue to talk this way, I'm going to have to report." And this conversation stopped. Then I would think there's nothing to report, right? The kid didn't overshare with me. The kid tested the waters, and then, you know, realized it was too hot, and so we moved on to something else. I'm not an attorney, but he's not giving me death stares, as I
think
say.
you have to get out in front of it. That would be my fear.
Yeah.
I think even the minute that kid tells you, I don't know that there's gonna be like a safe harbor where you can turn
No,
them
no, I'm-
gently around.
No, but I'm saying
and
like,
tell them. I think up front they need to know
yes.
if we hit on this at all, this is what's going to happen.
And I think like with Eric's example of like, I'm getting abused at home, and for this reason, like we're calling child services because of the reported abuse.
And you're also notifying them simultaneously. Arguably, one's gonna happen faster than the other, potentially. But let's just say, like
turnaround time and how fast you have to notify parents?
So we're gonna have to
Be
work.
like if the bank had to call your, abuser when you went to take them out, right? Like, we're actually, we've now been made aware of risk. Sure, we'll check the box and report to whom we need to report to the agency, but this law potentially is then requiring us to escalate that person's risk.
You're getting abused at home because of that, then they know already. So do you have to call and tell them because that's the reason they're getting?
You do, I bet like, to technically comply with this law, I bet you do. I bet you would have to over-communicate, not assume that they already know. But I keep coming back to, you know, it'd be nice if you just laid out up front, hey, here's what will happen, and here's some other resources in the community that are not obligated, to which this law does not apply. And you decide how to go from there.
I like that approach. I think the difficulty is when a kid's coming in your office, like a counselor's office, you don't always know exactly what they're going to share, right? So, and to put that on the front end for every kid you meet with, some of these kids might look at you like, "What the hell are you? Sorry, what are you talking about?" Sorry, we're like, but they might be like, "What are you talking about?" So, yeah, we're gonna have to. The counseling staff, we're gonna have to support them, figuring out a can statement that those who know, and those who are naive just keep coming in to talk to their counselor about schedule or their interactions with peers or whatever they're coming to the counselor for.
So moving on then from House Bill 8, um, see as a board occur. Oftentimes, what I see on these is discussion, and then the administration doesn't have clear guidance on like it's, so I'm a takeaway action plan how we processed, and if all five of you are here, like, these are things that we definitely see go down. So I've heard some of those things, particularly as we were talking about code of conduct, licensure code of conduct. Obviously, it keeps on coming back to training and staying on top of those things and how that goes. But if there are other, here's what we see, and here's what we want to continue to see and implement those sorts of things, so that we know going forward. I can support however the administration board wants me involved or doesn't want us involved on that. Again, I think the House Bill 8 resources that we've provided will help manage with a number of those things that we've kind of talked about at the surface level, but there is going to be ongoing work on that, certainly, as things evolve. But in general, just from the student safety perspective, I know that we have already, this was not something we spoke about specifically, but we were already in process of updating the anti-bullying reports that need to occur, so that's another takeaway that somewhat relates overall to student safety, so we're on the ball on that. And then if there were other specific issues or tasks that you saw that needed to occur.
I think just one other law was Collins Law, because I know it applies to K-12, even though it's not, there's not a required training like there is for higher ed. I think we have policy, so it's hazing. I think we have policy that maybe it falls under bullying too, but I think things I hear, sports teams where it seems good natured, but seniors are given special privileges that they get to make other players do. Like, I think maybe if we kind of have some attention on that and kind of include that, I think that'll be a little bit of a culture shift. Again, not hearing of anything like horrible that you think, oh my gosh, this is really rising to that level, but just maybe some little things that I think, you think that might fall under that policy. So if there's some type of inclusion in there for that. But I think that comes then to more like coaching stuff or, you know, activities.
You're right. There definitely are hazing policies. I believe the one is associated directly with the harassment, bullying, intimidation. There may be a separate hazing as well under the OSB policies, but I know that you definitely have the anti-hazing policies in place.
It's just enforcement, you know. It's, I think, creating a culture where there's accountability, which means enforcing these, making sure everybody is very clear on what all these are and how it impacts them and their job, or their roles, even as students and coaches, but then enforcing it and making sure we're following up on it.
I think that's the consistency is the biggest thing that I'd like to see is we're consistent. We're not just sometimes following policy, but we are always following policy. We're always cognizant of what our policy is.
It's a bit of that like safety culture kind of mindset that is kind of like transparency. Really about like the overarching issue, setting aside like specific facts or specific names, but like, you know, are there situations where we talk about, and put it in a manufacturing sense, like a safety stand down. There's been an accident at a plant. You're going to convene like every plant that has that piece of machinery. You're going to let them know that this happened. We're not going to say who the employee is, but maybe there was a serious injury or we're going to put enough information out there so that, and then it's, hey, this is the go forward. Either we're taking all these machines offline so we can have an engineer take a look at this. This is new guarding that's going up, whatever it is. But it's that transparency and not being afraid to say like, hey, we had a miss today, but we're going to talk about it so that we don't have a miss anywhere else. I think sometimes but there can be a hesitation to do that, like, oh, can't talk about anything, or you know, we're so worried about getting sued that we're going to let that prioritize prevention of transparency. So I think probably some guidance as to, you know, when there are situations where, and it could even just be locally too, that where we see over in another school district something that like, but like talking about those things in an open enough way, again, not from a gossip, right? Like take the people out of it, but more of this, like, what's the issue? What's the process improvement so that this doesn't happen again, or that everybody's aware of this so that we don't find ourselves in the same position. So I think, you know, as a district, how do we find that right balance so that we can have open communication at the right time, rather than be like more in CYA mode, which I don't, even as an attorney, I don't tend to find that useful in this situation. I would much rather focus on prevention, process improvement, than on covering each other for one situation.
Are you saying that to occur at administrative level, like administrators are responsible for carrying that out and communicating to other administrators and then staff, or is that a board? Okay.
And I think it is at the management level on down, but with the board support, understanding that, you know, like our priority isn't to be perfect. Our priority is you can be a good leader and bad things will just happen. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's what you do next that defines whether you're, you know, a good leader.
A little bit to that. James and I had an exchange about psychological safety in the book, with Amy Edmondson's work, and how critical the psychological safety is with knowing, and precisely that. Like, we're a learning organization, and not saying like, oh, because we're a school, we're learning, but every organization should be a learning organization. We acknowledge, like, people make mistakes, people are messy. You don't know what necessarily somebody's going to do day in to day out, but we acknowledge it. It's how we handle it and do better to go forward. And, you know, you look at the case, I think one big case is, you know, Volkswagen, and trying so hard to meet these standards of emission standards. And they had a culture where it was everybody needs to perform, everybody needs to hit this, nobody can violate, we can't have any missteps. And it was a huge blow up that they were falsifying, because the people who were down below knew that things were going wrong, but there was not a culture where they were any way, shape, or form free to raise those concerns and issues. And it just really imploded for Volkswagen when it was West Virginia University, of all places, I think, that did an emissions study and were like, this is completely false. They falsified all of this data. And so it's that culture where people can just talk and openly because they want to support one another in being the best that everybody can be. Students don't learn without psychological safety. Your nervous system gets triggered, you're in self-defense mode. You can't learn.
So our hazing and bullying policies, we have two of them. Neither one has been updated since 2022.
Advancements since 2022.
You guys are doing pretty well on policies, actually.
Well, that's
General
because we have a
Assembly's been
policy.
otherwise
We have a
engaged.
policy team
If
here.
you're in the 2020s on your policies, then you're doing really well compared to some other places that I interact with.
I think action plan, I'm going to say training, right? Training, and training the core audiences that we our populations that we talked about, right? With obviously our administrators, manager level training, our coaches and volunteers who maybe we get that they have educator licenses, but maybe they're not immersed in the same way that you are when you work in school every day, all day. And then I guess two more populations. One would be students, and the other would be like parents / community. So that ideally everybody, so the equal training from a depth standpoint, there's at least alignment between these like general do's and don'ts of what's okay and not okay, so that everybody is on the same page. And I guess for the community and parents, maybe it's I get we have syllabus, I get we have handbooks, but at the beginning of the year there's like a barrage of stuff you have to sign. And so I get that's a checklist. Check the box, and I get they're supposed to read it all. But in reality, like we probably want to make some of this available and much more like easy to access, just in time and or when you need it sort of source, as opposed to being like, well, I gave you this at the beginning of the year. We're cool, right? Like the training, number one. And then I would like to ask for the rest of the board to consider on this House Bill 8. Is there some are we comfortable with, or can Dr. Tapman and his team look into a little bit more on what are we able to tell students, and where in the communication cycle can we tell them so that again they can understand the cause and effect of certain disclosures to certain people.
Yeah, so middle school is one of the elective offerings. Well, like forced elective offerings. So 6th, 7th, 8th grade, they have a 9-week course of it. And then when they come to the high school, they have a semester of it.
That can be kind of in the upperclassmen.
It's usually freshmen or sophomores. Yeah, so it's still in that. No.
Really in the curriculum, but I guess today or
But I'm thinking at the start of the year, the counselors do all throughout the year, the counselors do classroom lessons. And so maybe at the start of the year and at the start of the semester, in that classroom lesson they're incorporating some of this information for the kids as far as, if you tell us something that's in this theme, this is what we have to do, which is like mandatory reporting obligations, but then now also there's House Bill 8 obligations that they have. So yeah, we can incorporate that for sure.
Thinking on the training, I mean, not just these topics, all of our other policies. It's a pretty big task, right? In tall order. I don't know if Eric's the right person or your firm. Like, are there school best practices or consultants that have prepackaged? I mean, I don't know how much we want to spend, but it's a tall order to ask them to make all the content, I gotta send it out to all the constituents we just said, and
Is there something turnkey? I think that
Yeah.
we talked about that a few months ago.
even if it's just the materials are turnkey or just the
Yes.
yeah, like I mean, they don't have to conduct the whole.
Let's go back to safety.
Yeah,
There are
yeah.
turnkey, like, learning and education or development things you can buy, including down to the daily flashcard on your safety share that you can buy.
There are. It varies by, for example, reasonable suspicion training is a really important one. And that's a safety-related issue as well, and it's not just for bus drivers anymore. Reasonable suspicion training is something that your building principals should have as well, to identify if somebody's under the influence, what to do in response to that. Obviously, that's a major safety issue for a variety of reasons, but there are, if you will, canned reasonable suspicion training opportunities. I think that's how Schoolworks tries to do, like, here's our training, but it's not in-person training, right? And so you get into the mix of, all right, well, here we go again, I'm doing another module, checking the box. Or is it something that you feel like we got to put people in front of somebody live? And
You do both, right? I mean,
You
it
absolutely
doesn't have
could.
to be an either or. You know what I mean?
Absolutely agree with you. I mean, and ideally, that's what you're back to what Dr. Tappan said is people learn differently too. There are some people, like I had somebody come up to me and be like, I read every single tip sheet. I was like, you might be the only person in Ohio, but congratulations, right? Like,
I
there
probably
are
did.
Yeah.
and so, unfortunately, there's not one outfit that is just like, hey, here's what we do.
Yeah.
And there are certain things that legal can train on, and there are certain things where I would be the first one to tell you, anything about that, nor should you have any legal folks to talk about that issue.
And maybe it's something for discussion later with you two if you know of particular entities that, especially when you talk about including the parents and the students and these other constituents, because that's where I think, okay, we sent an email out that we changed board policy, whatever letters B, C, B, V, or whatever, and it was, and if you read it, I mean, there's some, there were some real changes in there to the texting and all these things we've talked about tonight, and if people didn't read it, I mean, you don't really know, and how do you engage those people without James and Mike and Tim and all the others in our staff trying to make content? If there's people that can help, I'm open to considering something for that. So
it's tough. It is because you have limited time too, right? And I mean, teachers have a contractual workday. There's contractual time that we're allowed to be with them. There's contractual time that we have for professional development. Same thing with parents. I mean, they're parents. I'm a victim of this, or I guess abuser of this. There are a lot of things that our school system puts on. I don't think they're going to make that. It sounds like we should make that one, but so it's tough. It's tough to roll it out.
And then also maybe have a couple offerings, opportunities if parents or community members want to learn.
Activities, I think I'd be curious to know how much of our student population. I feel like between those two umbrellas, it's a lot of kids.
For sure.
It's a lot of kids. Not everybody, but it's a lot of kids. They do.
Two districts, there were some really good examples of districts who have, and it kind of goes to your point earlier, which is, okay, we have a student handbook. What are the top 10 things we need to know in the student handbook? And they've done it as a presentation to the students as well, right? Like, we're pulling out the 5, 10 things. Like, here's what we're doing. I don't know when you capture them from a time perspective. Might have to be an assembly. Might have, if you've got time for that. But you could do something similar with the parents. You could do something similar with staff where it's, yeah, we know that we have X, Y, and Z, but here's at least 5, 10 things on the recurring. Here's the really important. It's not to say that everything else isn't important and that you can't, run afoul of others, but here's like critical mass kind of stuff.
In safety cultures, you still have the things that can get you, killed or maimed.
Yes.
And then you have the things that, like, they're not great, but, like, they're not going to kill or maim you most likely. And so if I'm trying to build a safety culture, like, where am I going to hit first? I mean, hit on the stuff that can kill or maim you, right? And then, like, once we've mastered that or we've built that culture, we feel good, now we can drill down into, but if I present everything as though it's all of equal priority and importance, then chances are nothing is going to stand out, right? And so I'm sure, Chris, you guys probably have like cardinal rules of certain things. Like if you do, the only thing that we ask is like, did you whatever, did you fail to wear fall protection when you were up at height? Yes. Thank you. You don't work here anymore, right? Like, I mean, that's because we're not here to give it any context. It's that important that that's how that goes. So I don't know what those cardinal rules are for us. I imagine that's an area of opportunity, James, to work with your team. But I would love to know what their version of what are the things that really put students at the most risk, particularly maybe that our staff or volunteers might play a hand in, and then how do we hit on those, whether it's 5 to 7 things. Now, once we feel like we have a solid start on that, we'll hit the next year, right? But again, it's difficult to boil the ocean and give everything equal priority.
And then the handbook and looking at it, like routine leadership or NHS or health class again. I mean, various things to if they had to present to their peers, what would it be? I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity there, and it's getting them hopefully in a place where
I'm just like imagining tracking the handbook on kids. Because the handbook it's like, it drives me crazy because the handbook is
So much, and it's like it's too much.
and because it's legislatively, a lot of it's like legislatively prescribed. I mean, there's times where I'm like, we don't have conversations at all about the policy because like it needs like basically the Ohio General Assembly is telling you this must appear in your book in these words. Okay, next discussion. Because like whatever I think about it, if I think it's an effective way to communicate, doesn't matter.
I think at the OSBA conference annually, there's different, you go to some of these really dry topics. I think there's been some, I know there was at least one on Title IX, and then I think there was another one on like Public Records and Open Meetings Act, and they acted up. It's a skit, right? And so and they keep it safe enough that it's, not, because those things can be really, really serious, but they do it enough in a way where it's funny, but it gets the point across, and there's maybe even, something happens, and then they'll be like, pause, and show hands or a placard or something to be like, is there an issue here? What's the issue? And then somebody kind of shouts it out. So it's really engaging way.
I've like started to bring things back to manufacturing, but maybe you have like a student safety, like a lot of times you'll have a joint management, like hourly employee committee, right? So that we're making sure that we get like appropriate feedback, right, in perspectives on something that's really important. Maybe there is like a safety committee that includes students, and ideally, I say this, like we have some really great students who appear in everything. Like, how do we engage, which is great, but like, how do we engage, a couple kids who may not be the kid that shows up at every NHS sources of strength, like how do we engage some of those other kids so that we get like a complete perspective, not just maybe like the perspective of, 1 or 2 kids who are super engaged in themselves. cabinet for a while, right?
Are
The
you still doing
superintendent's cabinet.
superintendent?
It didn't. So 2 years ago I ran it, and then this last year I didn't run it. But I have a topic here that we can run with. So yeah, we'll restore that.
And then do
I'll
we,
restore.
do we still do, we used to do freshman and parent orientation in the gym. Parents came, freshmen came, and it was kind of an overview of what to expect. And I mean, that could be, you have a captive audience, that could be a place where you could highlight the top 5 things in your student handbook.
Right. Yep. So at the high school, they have freshman orientation as like the kickoff for open house, and then the rest of the night it's like a traditional open house. So yeah, these are components that can be incorporated in there for sure. So,
I think it's just good to think of what is the relevant way of communication for our kids today. How are they going to absorb this information? You know, they absorb information differently than we do. You know? Sorry.
good. Well, I won't.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, that would be great. I might subscribe to TikTok.
Send it to me.
Okay. So for me, action steps are start to work with the administrative team to develop a training plan for code of conduct and FERPA. Include in that specific elements related to the different groups that we've identified: admin, staff, coaches, volunteers, students, and then parents, community. Review our reporting processes for different semi-annual and annual reports that have to go, making sure that they're done timely and accurately. So there's that. And then continue to research or study the obligations under House Bill 8 and ways to approach it in a meaningful way for students so they continue to feel supported while having our staff compliant with the expectations of House Bill 8. So I have those 3 sort of action steps.
Think that like higher, like a priority, like so that I mean it's a pretty do, but so that we can have resolution on that as close to the beginning of the school year as we can. I know it's maybe not day 1, but as close as we can.
And I'm thinking for me, the training, like an overview of these training plans, I'll be ready to present at the August 18th board meeting. And I will have an update on so yeah, we'll get it done. I will
I think
get it
the
done.
other 2 things just to consider would be that idea of that safety culture can be talked to the various populations, be it your building admins, maybe the teachers union, all that, but could be sent in 4th grade, like the safety share, safety minute, whatever we want to call it, but kind of quickly bringing safety to top of mind every time we convene, if we can.
I think that would be after, like once the school year is resumed and staff are back, they're not too responsive while they're enjoying summer.
I get it.
Yep. But yeah, that's definitely something that can be developed. Motion to adjourn.
Can we have a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved.
Mr. Rager,
Yes.
Mrs. Henners, Dr. LaFay, Mrs. Hartley,
Yes.
Mrs. Max.
Yes.
Thank you, Eric, for coming in preparation.
Thank you.